In this video, I'm going to be making a horror game in one day, then remaking the same horror game in 10 hours, then in 1 hour, and then in 10 minutes. Let's see what happens. To get started with our horror game in one day, we opened Unity and created a new project. The premise of our game was to create a horror platform game where the player essentially had to collect something to escape a maze whilst trying to avoid an enemy. Now, I know what you're wondering, that sounds exactly like the horror game I made in 10 minutes for that video where I made a horror game in 10 minutes, and it kind of is, except this is a platform game. Anyway, the reason I was going for this concept is because I think it works well as an outline, and we can add specific features to each game, like the fact our first game was going to be in 3D. I downloaded the Unity starter asset for a third-person character controller, which provided us with a character movement system. This was great for adding in platform features to our game. Now, to make this a horror game, I basically had to just make the game environment as dark as possible. There we go. It was now a horror game. So I basically spent a bunch of time adjusting the environment lighting settings in Unity, and I couldn't really get a good horror lighting, but since we needed to complete this game for the challenge, this is just what we were going with. The next thing I wanted to add was a torch for the player to hold, which just adds to the overall horror feel of the game. I did this by finding a torch asset on the Unity asset store, importing it into our game, and equipping it to our player object. And there we go, we had a torch in our game. I decided to adjust the game lighting now that we had a torch, and now we had a horror game. Now that we had our player and game environment set, it was time to build a level. Since we were making a horror platform game, I created a platform level. Basically, the player would work through this platform level to try and find coins that would allow the player to go through a door and beat the game. The concept was very straightforward, and after adding the coins and the door, our game was pretty much complete. Well, besides the enemy. For the game enemy, I decided to go with the same free model we used in our AI horror game. Basically, for that game, I got ChatGPT to try and make a horror game, and we used this free model as our enemy. Now, the enemy AI system for that game would basically have the enemy randomly move around the map and follow the player if the player was in range. But for this game, the enemy needed to basically follow the player through the entire map, regardless on whether the player was in a set range or not. So we created a script that would allow the enemy to follow the player. Here's how that turned out. Now, it worked, but it didn't really feel like a horror enemy, so we made it so the enemy would randomly change speeds while moving towards the player. After adjusting a few things with the enemy system, we had a working enemy AI, and with that, our game was almost complete. You're probably wondering though, can't the player just get onto a platform and avoid the enemy? Well, yes, and to fix that, we're adding in the final feature of our horror game, the jump scare. Obviously, horror games are known for jump scares, so we had to add a jump scare to our game, but we weren't going to go with a usual jump scare, like the jump scare in our AI horror game. We were going to implement a jump scare into our enemy movement system, and here's how that turned out. And there we go, we had our horror game created in one day. Before we continue with our next game, I wanted to take a second to tell you about a way to become a better programmer. Now, I'm not a great programmer, as you can tell by my games, but if you wanted to improve your programming skills, I'd highly recommend the sponsor of our video, Brilliant. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in math, data analysis, programming, and AI. Brilliant is a learning platform that is designed to be unique and effective. Their platform allows you to build understandings of concepts from the ground up, as their lessons contain hands-on problem solving that let you play with concepts. Brilliant helps you build critical thinking skills through problem solving, not memorizing. So as you work through content on Brilliant, you'll become a better thinker. I think a great thing about Brilliant is that it helps you build real knowledge in minutes a day, with fun lessons you can do whenever you have a chance. Now, the reason I was talking about programming before is that Brilliant has a growing number of programming courses, which are a great way to build foundations of programming and learn real-world applications. You can get familiar with Python and start building programs with the built-in drag and drop editor, you can learn essential coding elements, and you can develop your mind to think like a programmer. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/badgamedev or click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Now, let's make a horror game in 10 hours. To get started on our 10-hour horror game, I opened GameMaker and created a player movement system for a platform game. After I had a player movement system, I found a free player sprite on itch.io and added it to our game. Then, I found a free sprite for our game environment on itch.io and added that to our game. So this is what we had so far for our game. The concept for the game was pretty much the same as the game we made in one day, but a difference we were going to have was that the objectives the player had to collect to win would be randomly generated. This would make it so the premise of the game was to basically avoid an enemy for as long as possible whilst trying to find these randomly generated coins. 3 coins collected means the player would win. We added coins to the game, which were randomly generated, so the player could basically now move around the map and collect these coins at random. Now that we had the player movement system, the game environment, and an objective for the player, it was time to add the enemy to the game. For the enemy sprite, I basically just duplicated the player sprite and made it red. For the enemy AI system, I basically made it so the enemy had the same movement system as the player, and it would just chase after the player. Here's how that turned out. Now, obviously, it kind of worked, but I decided to add a bunch of enemies to the map to make things trickier. Also, if you're wondering about the jump scare, I think I'm going to make the fact that there's heaps of enemies the jump scare, because, well, I also adjusted the game lighting to make it a bit more of a horror game, and I decided to just add an endless enemy spawner, and there we go, we had a horror game made in 10 hours. To get started on our 1-hour horror game, I opened GameMaker and created a player sprite. I then created a player movement system. From here, I designed a level for our player to roam around, and then decided to make everything darker. Now we had a horror game. The next thing our game needed was an enemy that would chase the player around the level. I created a sprite for the enemy, which of course, since we were only making this game in 1 hour, was the player sprite duplicated and turned red. The enemy AI was pretty straightforward. The enemy would basically stand there until the player was in range, then it would follow the player. Did this work exceptionally well for our horror game and was an extremely advanced system? No, but we're only making this game in an hour, so this works. I increased the range on the enemy, so now the enemy basically followed the player throughout the entire level. The next thing we added to our game was an objective for the player to complete. This was pretty straightforward to do. The player just had to collect these 3 coins to be able to go through this door, which if they did, they would win the game. Now, even though this game was a horror game, it was missing one of the biggest horror game elements, a jump scare. Let's create a jump scare for the enemy. This works. Basically, this jump scare just appears at random intervals in the game. The player doesn't really expect it, and it can actually throw the player off a little bit when they're running away from the enemy, so it kind of works for the game. And there we go, we had our horror game remade in 1 hour. To get started on our 10-minute horror game, I opened GameMaker and created a player sprite. Then I created a player movement system, and I created an enemy that would follow the player. And there we go, we had a horror game in 10 minutes. Anyway guys, that's gonna do it for this video. We made the same horror game in 1 day, 10 hours, 1 hour, and 10 minutes. If you want to check out more of my content, including videos and games, feel free to check out my website over at badgamedev.fun. Thanks again to Brilliant for sponsoring this video, and remember, you can visit brilliant.org/badgamedev or use my link in the description to try Brilliant for 30 days. This link will also give you 20% off an annual subscription. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like. You can also leave a comment and subscribe to the channel if you're new. Peace.